Hello friends, for today's video we're back with another From Readers, specifically 2 writers from readers settings. And if you're new or unfamiliar, the idea behind this video series is there is some kind of question or prompt that is posted on both my community tab and my Patreon, and the responses are directed somewhat at specific groups. So in the past we've done 2 publishers, 2 other readers, 2 book talk, and today, as noted, it's 2 writers from readers settings. And the specific prompt said, what makes a setting come to life for you? What makes you feel immersed in one? Do you have any pet peeves when it comes to how a setting is shown to you? Whatever thoughts you have on settings, feel free to share them. Before jumping into it, just a heads up that the day this video goes up, I will have a new prompt over on my community tab, specifically 2 writers from readers villains. As always, I'm going to read through my patron responses first, just as a thank you to all of them for continuing to support me. If you are wanting to guarantee that your response gets read, I do always go through my patron responses, and then we'll segue over to the community tab. But jumping into it, first up, Michelle says, I love richly described settings, world building that is as you go. I love the descriptions to be appropriate to the story as it progresses. Info dump just confuses me and at some points ruins the story for me. I did take a tiny peek at the responses before jumping into it. I didn't want to go too in depth because I still wanted to be able to actually genuinely react to what you had to say, but I just kind of wanted to get a taste of what was something that came up a number of times. And the idea of there being info dumps as opposed to organic world building was really something a lot of you hit, and I completely agree. I understand that there are certain instances where it can be maybe age appropriate to have more information revealed depending on if you're writing for middle grade or maybe even the younger end of young adult. And it also can depend on the kind of fantasy you're writing. We won't always necessarily be specific about fantasy because obviously settings are within so many different genres. But with fantasy in particular, oftentimes you have to explain so much to the reader. And if it's an epic fantasy world, there's just no way that you can relay everything the reader will eventually probably need to know at the very beginning. However, you also want to invite them in, so you do kind of want to start to reveal things probably pretty early on. And you have to be mindful of how you do develop the world and how it relates to the characters. Otherwise, it's just too much all at once. It's too overwhelming, and it doesn't result in the world feeling epic. It just starts to feel convoluted. So I completely agree. We will, I'm sure, touch on this a lot more as we progress, but I completely agree that the as-you-go world building, even though it does mean that the reader is going to have to take it upon themselves to give the book a little bit more time before they potentially DNF. Even though that's true, I think it's certainly worth the risk as it's much more rewarding of both a reading experience and in developing the world in a way that actually feels like, oh yeah, this is a world that people live within. Next up, Christy. Hi, Christy. I love just being thrown into a fantasy world, kind of what we were just describing, and getting to feel like I'm experiencing it for myself. Nothing is more jarring than when the author is too heavy-handed with the world-building info dump or introduces the world in the most contrived way, a la Fourth Wing. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Fourth Wing. I won't comment on Fourth Wing specifically. I'll try to keep things more general. As far as having it feel like you're experiencing the world, I think a key way in which authors can achieve this oftentimes is when you don't, I know this gets overused, so apologies. I know people say all the time, like, show, don't tell. And some reviewers can take it to the extreme level where if there's even something noted to you in the narration, they're like, this is an example, you should have shown it to me. And you're like, okay, sometimes you just gotta tell people stuff. But I do think that a way in which it feels more real and oftentimes almost goes unnoticed is if the character is experiencing something without them telling you something. So as an example, if a character is walking outside, instead of being like, it's really cold in this kingdom, you know, something like that, and having a whole description about how, like, the kingdom is known for being frigid, and, you know, instead of that, you have the character have to put something on that is maybe like made of a certain material that's known to generally keep people warm. Or maybe while they're walking, they have to pull something tighter They note that their clothing isn't fit for this environment, as they can feel it going through their threadbare clothes, because this also doesn't just capture the setting, it also can clue you in about the character themselves. And wait a second, so if their clothing doesn't really, if it's not fitting for this environment, are they from here? Are they maybe poor and they can't afford the clothing that would be better suited for this place? Have they infiltrated this area? What's going on? And it builds that intrigue. And the sad part about world building that's done really well like this, and settings that are done really well like this, is what I just said, that it can go almost unnoticed. So it almost can go unappreciated. But when you find yourself being like, why do I feel like I just get so lost in this book? And you really start to peel apart what made you feel connected to it, it's usually when the world building is developed in these more subtle ways. Next up, Michael, your response is very long, so I'm going to wait for a sec. I'm going to get through some of the shorter ones, and then we'll dive into yours. Lizzie says, what makes a fantasy setting feel real for me is when the magic, for example, in the world impacts other aspects such as politics, economy, culture, religion, and so on. Completely agree. I think that's important, even if it's the kind of book where the fantasy/magic isn't the main focus of the story. I also love it when you feel like the society in such a world has a history and is ever changing, even if slowly, or if the book is only a snapshot of just one period of time. In terms of immersion and bringing a world to life, I think little details go a long way, especially if they're different to our own world, such as food and clothes and music, etc. Yes, 100% agree. You definitely touched on a lot of different things here, and you certainly expressed how you felt really well, but I do want to expand on the idea of, you mentioned the magic as an example, and it being tied to all of these other parts of the world. And I think that's something that when authors are just at the beginning stages of crafting their world, because not every author goes about their story the same way, meaning they don't write their story the same way, they don't write their characters. And something that's fun, if you look at author interviews and they're talking about their process, is where do they start? Do they start with the world? Do they start with a magic system? Do they start with a moment, a scene, a character? So it doesn't always have the same origin, and we wouldn't expect it to, and we don't want it to. We want authors, whatever their creativity process is, their creative process, I don't know why I said it like that, whatever their creative process is, what works for them is what works for them. So I don't want to try to, pigeonhole and force them into a certain direction. But when they start to think about the magic, it is important to ask the questions of, do people in this world fear magic users, or do they revere them? If they revere them, that might have more impact on the religion. If they fear them, that might have more effect on the laws of their world. And that means that magic users might have to stay hidden, or if they aren't staying hidden, they might have to be relegated to initially the appearance of villain. Or are they trying to break the system down? The story can start to craft itself just by asking these simple questions. And in the same way, I think readers have tuned into that. Artemis97, your response says, I love when a writer gives you glimpses into the larger world that don't necessarily connect to the main plot. The best example I've seen are the epigraphs before the chapters in Dune. It makes the world seem so much more fleshed out and real. I'm glad you provided an example. I'm going to go a different route. I'll still provide an example, so not a completely different route, but I'm going to mention a different book. And to your point about you just see glimpses, I've noted before that the Goblin Emperor, I think the way in which the setting and the world is revealed to you in that, you really do just get the smallest of glimpses. But I do think that it is very necessary for the experience of that story. And if you don't know, the idea is this character who should never have basically ruled is now finding themselves to be emperor, and they are so a fish out of water. They don't know anybody, they don't know their motivations, they don't know who's who, what's what, and who they can trust. There's a lot of danger, but there's also a lot of really big decisions that are now falling on this character. And as a result, this is a situation where you want the reader to feel somewhat disoriented. If you have the reader have so much information, then either you have more information than the main character, whose name is Maya, and then you're just like watching Maya helplessly try to figure things out, and you're like, okay, but that's not a big deal, it would be weird to clue you in. The idea is that you want to be alongside Maya, experiencing the story with him, so when somebody shows up, or when a certain culture is mentioned, or the differences between people that are experiencing poverty versus people that have a lot of wealth, when those things are touched on, Maya has to try to piece everything together very quickly, and you understand why it starts to feel like there's just one thing after the next. And I personally loved that. Doesn't mean everybody has to like that book, but I think that going about the world building in that way, where you only get these brief glimpses, really highlights how much Maya has to have on his plate. I thought that the execution of the world was great in that, but if you asked me, like, who's who and what's what, I couldn't tell you. So it's an instance where being in the dark served the purpose of the story, I think. So Michael, I mentioned you had a really long reply, but so did Friend Owl Design. So I'm going to read Friend Owl Design, and then Michael, I'll read yours, and then we'll segue on over to the community tab. So Friend Owl Design says, when you see the give and take in a satisfying world that's well developed, it's not just setting a mood, it's an economical way to give more backstory clues for characters or cultural points. If you info dump everything at some point, you've wasted all of your metaphorical arrows before a more appropriate target down the line arrives. The grounding effect of making sure a setting affects characters in a believable way via values, food, clothing, jobs, etc. makes me way more likely to be immersed and not want to put the book down, but only if it's revealed over time organically as the characters naturally interact with what's around them or at hand. I love when clues are left to hang in the dead space of what's described, much like how a masterfully composed illustration says just as much in its negative space as it does with the subject. I just want to say, I really love how you articulated that. I thought that was really beautiful. I'm going to note just really quick that I think, to your point about the way that art can be utilized, I think that even just the way in which a fantastic cover artist can represent a story is noteworthy and often kind of ties back to how much effort, not always, because oftentimes, you know, an artist is just told something vague. But we have certain, especially with self-pub writers, who have a little more say over their covers if they are able to have a cover artist do a beautiful cover. If they've really thought through the world, then I think a lot of times the illustrations are going to showcase that. I think that fan art, really well shown settings, often result in some of the best fan art. I think there's a reason, whether you like it or not, of course, everybody's tastes are different, but there's a reason I find that the fan art for the Cosmere is so fantastic. The way that Luthadel is depicted, the way that the mist cloaks, which is tying back to sort of like this Mistborn culture, you could say. And then, of course, Stormlight Archive, the way that the beautiful art is done for that, the way that the chasms are done, the chasm fiends, the storms, all of that is so fantastic. So even though I know that's not exactly what you were touching on, I just think that really great art and cover art can be really tied to the creativity of the writer. Continuing on with what you were saying, this doesn't just mean fantasy as a genre either, but fiction or anything else needs an appropriate tone to fit the ambiance of what all five senses will take in. And those physical senses should reflect in the character's emotions. It comes down to striking a balance of intentionally enough appropriate description versus not wasting the ability to discover the world along the way via too much exposition all at once. If the setting is treated as its own character, it could enhance an already wonderful book and save a subpar work. One obvious umbrella example is Hogwarts in the Harry Potter series. It was given a lot of character by the author's descriptions, but plot elements were heavily tied to it as well. The culture of the school was explored via contextual clues. Even the characters were shown to view the place as a friend with its initial safety and comfort. There was specific and consistent, yet not redundant language with the tone the author wanted to convey about that place, and an approach like that is worth taking note of. The Seven Realms series did this with the cultures being intrinsically shaped by their surroundings, not just by the larger cultures in general, but even the characters living in the same city could be drastically different as a result of which district they belong to. Speech patterns, accents, attitudes, and even the morale of the characters change depending on the setting, because whether real or not, the world surrounding people has an impact on them. On a similar note, Tolkien and Paolini in Lord of the Rings and the Inheritance Cycle did a neat job with place and names. They didn't entirely copy some foreign language just to make places sound mystical. They paid attention to etymology and leveraged unique place names that readers subconsciously picked up on the patterns. Kids these days call that place a vibe. Long answer, but those are my watered down thoughts without it turning into a PowerPoint of all of my favorite authors' writing styles. I really appreciated that you gave specific examples. You, similarly to what I said about another response, you articulated everything so beautifully. You gave those examples. I do want to expand on one specific thing. You mentioned the 7 realms and how you can have characters living in the same place, but depending on where they live, the district, how they speak might be different, how they act, and even the way in which they view things is very different. And another story that I think does this really well is one that I've been watching recently and that I've been having such a good time with would be the Apothecary Diaries. And I've been covering that over on my side channel. I absolutely highly recommend watching. I recommend the sub because I'm not one of those, people that's like sub over dub, but sometimes. But anyway, one of the comments on the first impressions, non-spoiler, and then also getting into spoilers for the first few episodes, and something I was noting about the main character is that she is just so likable, she has so much character, and she's not an extroverted person by any means. She just has certain passions, and this won't turn into a gush session for that character, but this character, when she has something happen in her life, she's almost resigned to it, which in other stories might be looked at as, oh, this character, they're apathetic, they don't really have a lot of initiative, which isn't true for this character. She definitely has these things that she cares very much about, and she has people she cares about. So there is this question of, okay, well then why is she like this? And in her society, she is of very low birth. They don't necessarily go through the story saying this person's of low birth, therefore this is what is in store for their life, whereas this person has this much, and this is what's in store for their life. They don't give you this hierarchy, but it is understood that part of the reason why she just accepts the situation she's found herself in this story is because she knows, as a result of being low birth, there isn't really room for her to go up against her superiors. If she does, there's nothing to fall back on at all. So it makes more sense for her, and she has been somewhat conditioned throughout her entire life to just obey and keep her head down and move forward. It informs a lot of her decisions, and it's a way of expanding on the world and revealing the world to you, in this case, viewer, although there is source material that you can read. It's a way to reveal this all to you without just telling you everything all at once. Moving on now, Michael, your response says, warning, this comment turned into a mini essay somehow, apologies in advance. Although I use an example from, quote, high literature, whatever that is, I am emphatically not making an argument that all fantasy needs to be, quote, unquote, literature. I hope that comes across. I love fantasy. Anyway, about setting and what makes it work for me. What does this for me is a unity or marriage of style and setting, a fitness of one to the other that creates a sense of mutual necessity. And I wish publishers were more interested in this than in sound-like formulas. Variety and distinctiveness in the market and supported by advertising could make for a richer range of experiences for readers. Already, thank you for your little mini essay because I'm so enjoying what you have to say. For me, meaning back to Michael, for me, much of what makes a book compelling has almost nothing to do with where it is set or even what it's about. Those things are just initial postulates, an indication that this fictional universe is thus and so, and that minds and interests will intersect there. Whatever the premises of a story, for me, everything hinges on what the writer makes the setting do. This might sound cloudy, so I'll give an example. I happen to be reading a book right now that isn't fantasy. It's set in the South in the first decade of the 20th century and occupied with piecing together an account of events that occurred before, during, and after the Civil War. It's by William Faulkner, and it's called Absalom, Absalom. The setting is Mississippi, and Faulkner brings it to life in a variety of ways, all of them to do with style as much as you might call info dumping. He creates the feeling of a place and time by subtly tracing out the peculiarities of individual humans' thoughts and obsessions by pointing to moral decorums and moral blindnesses, to the sense of particular flowers, to the way everyday people's lives can have mythic elements in them. Now, lots of people have written about the South and described the scent of wisteria or honeysuckle or bloom, and perhaps even the play of dust in the shards of light through the blinds of a claustrophobic room on a hot, late Mississippi summer afternoon. Many writers, of course, inherited a vocabulary and a strategy for creating this sort of atmosphere in a given setting from Faulkner himself. But what makes me love the novel, ultimately, is that its setting and the language that manifests it make possible something as grand as passages like this one, which for me strikes at the heart of what it is to be human in a very uncomfortable way. One character's description of language itself as that meager and feeble thread by which the little surface corners and edges of men's secrets and solitary lives may be joined for an instant now, and then before sinking back into the darkness where the spirit cried for the first time and was not heard, and will cry for the last time and will not be heard then either. that the wordless cries of our deepest selves are always unheard at birth, at death, and at many points between. The language itself is at once a bridge and a barrier between ourselves and the whole world and other minds, is a terrible thought, especially because we will all recognize that it is true, even if most of us don't tend to think of it that way and are saner for it. But my point here is that the novel creates a world and characters where this kind of talk belongs. It belongs in this distinctive vision of the world. The novel feels unique as a result. That passage doesn't necessarily belong anywhere else. Every metaphor or symbol seems pointed and pregnant. To use booktube language, the storytelling is extraordinarily intentional. The passage on how much of what we are is incommunicable is right at the heart of the novel's concerns. But it is not a climactic moment. It's a parenthetical aside. Let me just say, this is all lovely. I feel like I am transported back to elementary school and being called on for popcorn reading and being like, dang it, the next paragraph has a lot of big words. Don't mess it up. Don't mess it up. Which I know makes me sound like I'm saying I'm, a third grader again. I'm just saying that feeling of like, oh, I'm nervous. I have to read this in front of other people. Anyway, I'll get back to what you're saying. In a lot of what's being written, not only in genre fiction, but literary fiction, that passage I quoted would be dismissed as pretentious purple prose. I'm suggesting that the author's job is to create a setting in which their characters can say something, even something like that, without it feeling showy and out of place in context, and that possibility is an effect of the relationship between style and setting. When fantasy doesn't work for me, it usually has something to do with a sense that the language doesn't body forth the setting, and vice versa. When the language suddenly reaches for eloquence, it sometimes sounds purple and grandiose because the world, the setting, doesn't create a place where that flash of style seems to belong. Of course, I'm not saying that any other book on earth, let alone contemporary fantasy, should sound like Faulkner. Imagine Legends and Lattes written by William Faulkner. Check, please. Decidedly not cozy. And just not how caffeinated orcs talk, I suspect. But I do tend to love books, fantasy and otherwise, in which the writer finds a voice unique to their setting and marries the two in such a way that they seem to make each other feel necessary. Probably a bit longer and more impressionistic than you were looking for, sorry Elle, and everybody else masochistic enough to have read this, but I'll stand by the basic idea that when this union of style and setting occurs, magic happens and a world is made. This to me is what world building in its most profound sense really is. And that doesn't happen enough these days because of how few risks editors and publishers take with linguistic play. That's what's underneath all this. There seems to be a lack of interest in the electricity of language itself. A great novel, at least for me, teaches me to speak its language. It says, read me this way. Okay, I'll just go sit over there in the corner. Don't go to grad school or you too could end up like this. You had so much to say and so much of it was said. There's a fuzz. How delightful. The idea of there being this consistency with style between what has been created in the world, what makes sense, and what the characters think and feel and how they speak. So I've noted before, and sometimes I think that when an author is very aware of what they're doing with their voice in the story and how it relates to the setting, that it can have polar opposites. It's not that I'm disagreeing with you. I'm saying there are instances where I think it works because, to use the booktube speak, there's intentionality there. And I've mentioned before that part of what I liked about the story Gideon the Ninth is that there were times where the author was definitely, I felt, flexing their writing muscles a little bit, followed by the absolute stupidest of humor, and it would truly be followed by, it would be back to back, this long, beautiful, lush description, and then a character being like, I feel like a D-bag. And that juxtaposition was hilarious to me. And there was a means of integrating humor into the story, and I feel like that's why Gideon the Ninth can be hit or miss for people, but it certainly is different from a lot of the other things we've experienced before. Whereas you mentioned Legends and Lattes being something that it would be very odd if suddenly you had this poetic, beautiful, eloquent thing, as caffeinated orcs probably are going to be a little bit more blunt and straight to the point. But I do think that Travis Baldree establishes the feeling of cozy in the story by tapping into the senses of what the coffee smells like, the wood that's being used to build these various different parts within the shop, the cinnamon rolls that are baking, and then also somebody eventually plays music in there, so then the music is forming some kind of feeling within it. So there's so much to be said about what you're touching on, which you're not even just touching on it. You really did capture so much of this entire topic within that. But I do think there are times where there can be misses. And I prefer when I do these videos to highlight the things I think do these things well, as opposed to giving examples of like, this is an example of something that was bad. So I won't say the specifics, but there is a certain series where I think it's kind of an invitation to, I'll say navel gazing, even though I feel that sounds negative. But there are times in the story where characters kind of just sit and philosophize. And something that irks me that other people actually do appreciate is I find that certain characters will have certain experiences in their lives and they will speak a certain way, but their internal voice sounds exactly the same as another character's. And the reason that doesn't work for me is it means that there is this disconnect between the character that you've written and what you as the author wish to say. The reason this works for some people is they have articulated, well, in my opinion, this shows that anybody is capable of having really deep, complex thoughts, which I don't disagree with. I think people can, of course, from all walks of life, have deep and complex thoughts. I just don't like when it feels as though every single character's internal voice sounds the same, and that voice is the author's. That, to me, takes me out of the story. And it also no longer feels like these philosophical questions that are being presented are relevant to that world. It feels like you're using this as a jumping off point to talk about our world. And I prefer for the settings in my fantasy, because of course, settings in fantasy can represent things in our own world. But you want to see something that is relevant here and then be like, that speaks to me because that's similar to this. Not, I don't feel like you're talking about this anymore. I feel like you're talking about this. And it doesn't feel like it's actually related. So anyway, it's very hit or miss. I mean, this is why settings are more than just the trees are pretty in this world, you know what I mean? It's not just that basic. Anyway, jumping now to the community tab. I will not be able to get to everybody's responses because there were a lot, but I will try to get through as many as I can. I love when a setting feels lived in, not just like our main characters are the only ones that exist. It's like when you're playing a game and you see all the NPCs going about their day, walking around and working. Now, I know we're specifically more so focused on books, but I think a great jumping off point of what you just described is in fantasy adaptations when their clothes look pristine, but they're apparently traveling on some great quest, and you're like, you just rub some dirt on it or something, please? Because I don't think that's the costume department's fault at all. Somebody spent so much time and effort making the attire look fitting for the world, but then nobody went and like roughed it up to match what the characters are experiencing. So yes, I agree. The lived-in feeling is incredibly important. Knowing the weather or the season really helps create atmosphere. Oh, I agree. I like this. Also, as someone who isn't a visual reader, I love it when the descriptions involve more than just the way things look. The feel of sun on your skin, the sound of crispy leaves under your feet, or struggling to walk in snow, it all contributes to the setting and the atmosphere. 100%. And I think, too, something that's notable is when in epic fantasy, I really like, if you're going to look at people that are in a lot of different places, if somebody lives somewhere where it is known that it's, colder in that environment, as winter comes, the cold becomes so much bigger of an issue. However, if another character lives somewhere where it's hot, they're probably not even really thinking about the weather that much because now it's just nice. Usually for them, it's really, really hot. So the heat is what they're concerned by, not the winter. So just to see that, it doesn't just stand out as like these characters are in different places, but it makes what the characters are experiencing very different. It kind of grounds you so that when you go from one character to the next, your brain starts to just sort of naturally orient itself to that location. Next up, the physical effects of the setting. Dry, cracked lips in dry heat. I was going to say dry cold. I have chapped lips constantly, and Arizona winters, oh my gosh, do my lips get dry? But yes, anyway, completely agree. Lung clouded feeling from humidity, the specific smells, the cramped narrowness of the doorways. For me, it's all visceral. The thing that shows me it was drawn from / inspired by real experience, even if it is a fictional one. And I think this is something important to note. Right now, I have said before that I have to turn my air conditioning off in my house when I'm filming because the AC unit is right there, right next to my window, and it is so loud, and the microphone, sadly, does pick it up, so I can't film with it on. However, it's also really hot, over 100 degrees where I'm at right now, and my house, it's certainly affecting me. The lights in this room, also very hot. So if I want to think about the stuffiness of a room, I can just think about this exact moment. And so if there are characters who are stuck somewhere, maybe they're hiding out, but they're having to hide for a long period of time, tapping into these sorts of things is exactly like what you were describing, where it immediately, you're like, oh my gosh, I feel that. And it allows the reader to imagine themselves in certain scenarios. And then they're like, oh, that sounds miserable. And I think a great example of a book that does this really well and ties back to the idea of seasons would be The Bear and the Nightingale. There's a reason that people read that and they're like, oh my gosh, I feel cold. The next comment says, tell me what the character sees. So many scenes where it's like the character goes from X to Y and the plot is developing, but the setting hasn't been described. Honestly, I love a dedicated page describing the color of the leaves and views of the hills, types of buildings that might be in the distance, etc. Make me feel like I'm there. And then there's a reply that says, funny how different we all are. I hate unnecessary descriptions. Give me some really interesting observations about a particular person or part of the room and I am happy. When authors take too much time explaining the layout of an insignificant room, landscape, or stuff like that, hair colors, etc., I lose interest so fast. I once almost put down a book because of the detailed descriptions of each and every weapon. So I don't actually think that we're necessarily completely disagreeing, actually, between these two statements, because I think in the second response about give me the observation of the characters, a few things with that, and then I'm good, I think that the character can observe the color of the leaves or the buildings in the distance. And I think that both things can be present. And when sometimes we can have long descriptions that actually feel relevant to the character, to the story, to what's occurring. But there are times where it just feels like, okay, I gotta set the mood. And then we get this long description and then we go to the character and the two things are removed from each other. So for me, a lot of it really comes down to how it's connected to the character. And I think a perfect example of, and this was actually kind of a risky decision, but how in the First Law trilogy, in the first book, The Blade itself, Joe Abercrombie doesn't really go too in depth giving you this giant description of what this one particular area looks like that a lot of the characters are starting out in. It's not until another character makes their way to that place and they are not familiar with that area do you get this sort of sweeping description of this place. And I think that really highlighted the differences between these characters. So the ones that were familiar with this place, they're going to take note of their surroundings as it is relevant to them. So a very obvious one that I think a lot of people point to, the character Glokta hates stairs. So anywhere he goes where there's stairs, he's like, I hate this place. I hate stairs. I hate all stairs. They're the worst. And then another character might be more so focused with, okay, I'm in this room with a bunch of people and they're talking about politics and I don't really know what's going on, but I'm here and that guy looks like this. And so that character, how he thinks about what's around him is relevant somewhat to his personality and the fact that he's kind of oblivious about everything. However, when the newcomer comes in, they're like wowed by everything. So everything is something kind of impressive to comment on. And all of that relates to the character. I do think there are times, to the second comment's point though, that authors can go a little overboard with their descriptions to the point where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm bored. There was a book that I started and then eventually DNF'd because I didn't actually like, when the plot did start to develop, I was like, I don't really like this. I'm pretty sure I counted that it was 17 pages. The first 17 pages were just describing this setting. And I was like, what's this about? Who are we following? What are we doing? I don't care about it. It's the same with, it's not exactly the same, but it's similar to when authors start with action scenes because you're like, you just threw me into something and nothing really matters to me. That person can die. I don't know if they're good or bad. What's my reaction supposed to be? I don't know. Maybe this character that I'm with is sad about it, but I don't know them. And also, they might be sad, but what if they're both the bad guys? So, like, they're sad, but are you trying to make me sad for them? Because I'm not, because I don't know that, when you don't give us a reason to care, then it doesn't matter how beautiful the descriptions are. You can compliment the descriptions, but they're not going to enhance the story, and they're not going to actually make the reader feel immersed. Because there's that missing piece of the human element to the description. Next step, while technique is always important, I find that the choice of setting is key. The most immersive settings for me are the ones that mean something for a character and plot and contains value. So many expositions have to take place in random inns, bars, living rooms, etc. Every plot point or conversation can be strengthened by a thoughtfully chosen setting. A character lost their family heritage. Let that conversation take place amongst the ruins. Has a character found a safe friend? Let them realize that in a warm cottage that they have made theirs. Is the eccentric heist leader revealing the plan? Have it take place in a secret room, overflowing with maps, notes, and suspicious tools. There are so many setting descriptions I'd rather skip, even if written well, because they don't tell us anything about the characters or their stories. I think that all of your examples, like for example, the one of the character feeling like this warmth and comfort within a setting that also feels that way, I think that in and of itself is a way of utilizing the setting to enhance what the characters are experiencing. I do think that if an author goes overboard with that, it can lean into feeling really cliche. As an example, if it's an action scene and it's stormy outside or something like that, where you're like, well, I mean, like, of course, it can fall into becoming cheesy. However, I do think there are instances where what is occurring around you is very much a reflection, and it can be very symbolic and very moving to have that incorporated into the story. A very sad example from my own personal life of the setting around me feeling like a representation of what I myself was experiencing is that, this is going to be a little bit of a bummer comparison, but it's relevant. So when I was my dad's caretaker, it was very unclear. Doctors could not figure out why he wasn't improving. And it was really difficult to day in and day out not be given answers, and doing everything I could to be there for him, to take care of him, but also feeling this sense of guilt makes me kind of emotional. But I had this sense of guilt, like somehow it was my fault. And one of the things that kind of fell back when I was spending all my time taking care of my dad, and he was obviously not able to take care of the things that he normally took care of, were his plants. So my dad loved to water his plants, trim his plants. He just loved everything to do with his plants. And he had 2 trees in the front yard, and one of them started to die. And it was it was not a brand new tree. This was a tree that he'd planted quite a long time ago. And I just remember when I could get around to watering, or if my husband watered, whenever I looked outside and I saw that tree, I just felt like it was a representation of my father's deteriorating health. And that always really gutted me when I looked at that tree. It did eventually die. And that's part of what I mean by sometimes the environment, and to bounce off of what you're saying, the environment can be a reflection. It can be symbolic. And it's not necessarily always cheesy. There are instances where human beings naturally sort of project onto their settings what they're experiencing. So I do think that can be utilized really beautifully and really tragically, or really in a funny way. You can utilize it really well, but I do feel authors have to be careful if they lean into that too often. As I said repeatedly here, it can just feel cliche. This next one actually gets into a pet peeve. It says, I'm a very visual reader and picture pretty much every scene. My biggest pet peeve is when an author barely describes the layout of a setting, but then later in the story pinpoints specific actions/movements a character makes in that setting. I'll have pictured a whole room layout in my head, which then makes absolutely no sense because a character will walk through a door on the left when I only pictured one on the right. Totally breaks my immersion in the story. I'd much rather a setting be described in detail at the start, or have no specific stage directions, which then lets me imagine everything how I want. I do think that action scenes do have some relation to the environment around them, which makes sense, but I do think a lot of authors and any kind of advice things about writing will tell authors oftentimes to avoid being overly specific, because it can result, one, in exactly what you're describing, where even if the setting was described well, there's just certain details that you're probably going to miss in describing the setting to the reader that will become relevant in this overly detailed action scene. But also, people don't care. They care about how they feel in action scenes a lot of times, and of course you need to somewhat ground the reader, but for the most part, they want to know the suspense of it all. They want to experience that. They want to feel in danger alongside the character. So they don't need to know, like, they turned 90 degrees this way, and then they grabbed this thing that was 3 feet away from them, and then they reached for a weapon that was 7 feet long. That's a really big weapon. Is it Cloud's Buster Sword? You get what I'm saying. The extreme details and the settings, if you hold back a bit from those, unless they're relevant, but if you hold back a bit from those, they can prevent what you're describing. I really like specific but short descriptions. I once read a book that was really nice overall, but the author described the settings so much that it destroyed the pacing. Dude was literally getting chased through a building and still told me what the kitchen layout was, even what kinds of spices stood on the shelf. I do agree. There is a time and a place to describe things. I think it can be used for comedic effect, like if there's some kind of sticky situation and they're like, oh geez, I'm in trouble, but they still make time to like tell you about everything because they're trying to keep their mind off of whatever is going on. But that's very different from they're literally running through a building and they have time to tell you all those details. That's definitely a little extreme. Oh, this one just sort of reinforces something I said before. When a setting is described to you in a sense that the characters are experiencing it in that moment, in the tone of the character's thoughts or head voice. This is why we love Joe Abercrombie. Yep. Next up, details that are small but imply all the history, all the culture, all the beliefs, and conflicts without outright stating them. Just peripheral mentions that give the feeling of depth. A book that I actually thought did this really well would be Reign and Ruin. It's a fantasy romance story, but there's a reason that I always say it is fantasy romance for the fantasy reader, and that is because of how well the conflicts are laid out, how well the setting, that's the whole point of this, how well, like, the literal physical location that the characters are in, the building that they're in, and the differences between cultures, and the way that those conflicts slowly reveal themselves to you. It can make for it being a little disorienting at first, and you can maybe need some time to feel acclimated to the politics, because there's a lot of details that are ingrained in that. But yeah, I definitely think that in having those things revealed to you in a way that you're like, okay, so this person doesn't like this person because of some familial drama, but it's more than just familial drama because that person holds a lot of power. So if that person holds, and then like you kind of piece together and figure it out, and it really, I think, sucks you in when you have those question marks, like, wait a second, what was that about? But they don't tell you everything, because if they tell you everything, then it takes some of that, I gotta turn the page to figure out what was going on away from the reader. The next two comments actually touch on something similar, so I want to read those back to back, and then I'll go ahead and wrap it up for today. I know there are so many more things that we could dive into with this, and there were so many other responses, so I'll definitely be looking at these. And if you yourself are a writer and you feel like, wow, I'm getting a lot of information from this, definitely check out that community tab. I'll see if I can have that actual post linked so that you can scroll through for yourself. And also if you're a reviewer, I feel like a lot of you are so well able to put into words why a setting does or doesn't work, which I think it's not just for writers. I think this can be really helpful to reviewers as well. But all that said, I would like to maybe in the future not just have settings be the topic, but maybe something a little bit more focused in. This next one has to do with festivals. So as an example, maybe like culture could be something, or religion, and we can dive a little bit more into the specifics so we don't have so many different topics to cover all at once. I think settings maybe was a little too broad of a term here, but regardless, looking at these last 2 points, culture. One of the things that makes a world really come alive for me is the presence of cultural traits and festivals. Show me the cultural traditions, religious beliefs, and festivals of a people and how these affect the character's worldview. I will also add to what you just said, I think what helps is when you have characters looking forward to a festival, or you have characters that they have to try to save up money so they can wear a certain thing to this festival, or maybe it's important, like as an example, maybe the character, their family isn't doing well, but for appearance's sake, they still have to attend and they have to look as though they are doing well, so they're scraping by, trying, those sorts of things can really show the stakes for the character in what would otherwise just be like this event in the story, but why is this event significant? And then the next one says, for me, I love when festivals or holidays that are specific to the world interact with the plot. This makes the reading more immersive and like the author really took time to get down all the necessary details. And of course, understanding politics, international relations, weather patterns, and seasons. And that's nice because that captures so much of what settings entail. Like I said, I know I did not get to nearly as many as I would have liked to, because there were, I mean, even just in the ones we read, all of you really had so many great things to state about setting, so thank you so much. If you would like to, of course, expand on this in the comment section, feel free to do so. And if you want to give examples of books that you think really have great settings, feel free to leave those in the comments. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.